Hey, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, SBC 205 and SBC 209. Whatever time you're consuming this little piece of academic media, I am once again your instructor, Victor McInnes, coming to you live on tape from my spacious office here on the lovely campus of Aiken Technical College, located in the heart of the ever-expanding Graniteville, South Carolina metropolitan area. Remember, Aiken Technical College, your first choice for higher education in Aiken County. Hey, listen, today is going to be a rare joint SBC 205, SBC 209 session. I will be speaking to both the public speakers and the interpersonal communicators because today we're going to be talking about communication concepts. And as I began to prepare for this semester, what I began to realize was that chapter one of both books are almost exactly identical. Few changes. Please read your textbooks. They're both online. They're free. I'm a good guy. But what I want to make sure you do is that you read those, because there is things in those textbooks that may be on the final that I will not be covering in the lectures. But as I began to look at it, I began to see that they were really identical almost through the entirety of the lecture. So I'm just sort of combining them this semester. Everything that's covered was covered in both, so I'm doing them so like a joint session of Congress. On the rare occasion we are meeting together today. I will give you a heads up. We're only going to do this twice during the entire semester. Later on, you're going to get a lecture on culture and communication that I think is important for both classes to have. But as it is right now, what we're going to be talking about today is communication principles. So let's just leap into it. As I say, dive into it with both feet. Okay. So first of all, let's go back one before we jump into my bro stuff there. Okay. First of all, communication is, let's define communication sort of as a rule. Communication is the process of generating meaning by sending and receiving verbal and nonverbal symbols, and signs that are influenced by multiple contexts. Sending and receiving verbal and nonverbal symbols and signs that are influenced by multiple contexts. Okay? So what does that mean? Well, we're going to go over what that means. But again, the key things here is sending and receiving. Okay, so that definition of communication implies that there's a back and forth. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. And we're going to talk about context, symbol, signs. All that's going to come out as we go through the semester for both classes. Okay, so if we look at what people thought of communication over time, and yeah, I'm a nerd. I love science fiction. If you look at what people thought was going to happen with communication as we went through life, if you go back and just sample some good science fiction movies, you go back and look at George Lucas's first movie, THX 1138. You go back and look at Logan's Run. You go back and look at even the early Star Wars movies, the good Star Wars movies. That's not open for discussion. But if you go back and look at the 70s and 80s, when artists and filmmakers were looking at what the future was going to be like, there was this presumption that we were going to be a species that no longer spoke to each other in person. We weren't going to have any face-to-face communication. We were going to become more and more separate, more and more disparate as a whole. But then if you jump forward to like the later Star Wars movies, we began to see that communication becoming more and more apparent, that people were beginning to get engaged in communication more on a face-to-face level. It was kind of a throwback sort of thing. And then if you look at the Walking Dead, I mean, it is a small, compact group of people that are interacting on a daily basis face-to-face in order to survive. Okay, that is, to be honest with you, up through the third season of The Walking Dead. After that, I couldn't watch it anymore. I understand there's like 43 seasons now. I kind of dropped out after season 3. But I mean, the point being is, we thought that we could do without face-to-face communication, but what we've learned over the last 40, 50 years is the exact opposite. That we have a desire and we strive for communication. If you go back and you look at last spring, when everybody finally had to achieve or forced to achieve what people have been predicting, that we were no longer going to go into work, that we were no longer going to go into have face-to-face work communication, that we were all going to be sitting in our homes and looking at our computers and just emailing each other, What happened was, and there's been surveys to prove this, and people have written a lot about this. There became this drive to have face-to-face communication, and the only way we could do it is via Zoom, via Skype, Microsoft Teams, which is a creation of Satan, I believe. But let's not get into that right now. Okay. Facebook Live, we were doing these things so that we can continue to have face-to-face communication. Go back and look at SNL from like March and April last year when they came back on and started doing shows from home. About every third sketch was about people struggling with Zoom office meetings, Zoom dating. It was all subject. I mean, and again, I don't necessarily think SNL is the funniest show in the history of the world anymore, but you see that as a cultural phenomenon where people, as an indicator that people were out there really struggling to communicate. So we prefer to do things face to face in almost every case. It must be said that in the modern day, even with technology, you will be judged on your ability to communicate and your communication competence. And we're going to talk exactly about what constitutes communication competence at the end of this. Now, these two classes, SPC 205, we're going to be looking at one very specific form of communication, public communication. SPC 209 is going to be looking at a wider breadth of communication. Okay? But let's start off with one simple fact. A lot of people are going to talk to you and say, well, you've got the gift of gab. Okay, I've already talked to SPC 205 about the lady at the kennel where we board our dogs back in the before times when we actually left the CSRA for more than a day. And she came up, she asked, what do you do for a living, Mr. McInnes? We had a couple of minutes to kill. And I said, well, I teach at Aiken Tech. She said, well, what do you teach? And I said, well, I teach public speaking. And she says, well, how do you teach that? She was under the impression that public speaking and the ability to be an effective public speaker was just something you were born with. A lot of people you hear all the time talking about the gift of gab. Okay? There is no gift of gab. It is not an innate thing you're born with. Okay? Now, there are some talents that you can be born with, and a talent is a natural aptitude. Greatest piano player I ever knew was a friend of mine, in Auburn, had the longest fingers I've ever seen on a human. I mean, they were just phenomenal. And he had, when he stretched his hands out, I mean, you couldn't cover him with a plate. That naturally gave him a talent for the piano because he could reach the keys very easily. But there was a lot of skill involved, and skill is the ability to do something well through an expertise. Okay, it's not something that you just handle with. So my man here in your slide, I mean, looks like he's ready to chat. Okay, he looks like he's got the gift of gab, but that's something he's developed. Okay, it's not something that he was just naturally born with. So remember, communication is being able to competently communicate is a skill. And what we're going to be talking about for this semester in both classes is how we develop those skills. Now, the human communication process has certain core components. You can't get rid of any of them. There's 4 components that are listed here. First of all, you have to have 2 knowing components. Now, people always sit there and say, well, what do you mean knowing component? What or knowing participants? Those of y'all who are parents know exactly what I'm talking about. You've had a child standing 3 feet from you, and you go, Randy, go take out the garbage. Randy, go take out Randy, get the Randy. Until you flick water at them from the sink, and then they go, what? Doesn't matter if you're talking to Randy and tell him everything you need to know until he becomes a knowing participant and actively engages with you in the communications process. You're never going to say anything. Okay? So you can't have just one participant, and we'll talk about that in just a second. You have to have at least two knowing participants, people who have agreed to be in the communication event. Okay? You have to have a message. The message is why you need to communicate, what you intend to say. And the message doesn't have to be verbal or use words. We oftentimes get really hung up on verbal communication. You'll see here, these are through studies, 6, and again, I don't know if this guy and this guy are the same guy, but they look creepily enough like each other. These pictures show up on a whole bunch of websites. Anyway, so the message can be nonverbal. And again, here you see 6 common facial expressions that throughout the Western world, which would be Europe, the United States, Canada, North and South America, are pretty well recognized. Disgust, fear, joy, surprise, sadness, anger. These we all recognize. Okay? My kids used to tell me when they would come in and say something to me, they would always used to go, I have 2 daughters. They're now grown. I'm very proud of them. But when they were younger, they would used to come in and present a unified front and say, we would like to do this. And one time, one of my kids, they asked me something, and I just went, and my youngest daughter went, we got the eyebrow, we should leave. I didn't even have to say anything, but I communicated. I had a message, okay? Then you're going to need a channel. The channel is the means of communication, how you're going to pass your message. It can be sound, it can be visual, it can be tactile as in touch, okay? We have a lot of sound. You're getting my message through both visual and sound right now. But you get visual messages all the time, from a simple stop sign or a yield sign or a speed limit sign to more complex signs for every lawyer in the world out on the side of I-20. It can also be tactile in touch. Have you ever noticed in a fast food restaurant there's not a warm surface anywhere in the place except for in back where they're cooking? Fast food restaurants are designed intentionally to get you in and get you out. And that's a corporation communicating to you that you don't need to be here by having a chair that's it's cold, it's hard, it's just a little uncomfortable. Sure, sit down and eat your Happy Meal number 1, but then get out of my store. We need turnover. We need you to move. That's communication through a tactile means. So your channel can be sound, visual, tactile, and then you have to have a chance for feedback. There has to be a way for the 2 knowing participants to feed information back to each other. Okay? And by that, what we mean is, we'll talk about feedback in a minute. Okay? So the 4 components of human communication are at least two knowing participants, a message, a channel, and feedback. You'll see that a lot as we go through the courses. So there are 5 forms of communication. SBC 209, we're going to be talking about 2 through 5. SBC 205, we're going to be talking about 3 through 5. Your skills that you pick up in SBC 205, public communication, is going to be good for the bottom 3. Okay, let's talk about the first one, intrapersonal communication. I put a question mark next to that because people have been arguing for decades as to whether or not that's really a thing. Can you talk to yourself? And I'm not talking about vocalizing your internal monologue where you hear before a basketball, you see a guy dribbling a basketball out on the foul line going like, you can do this, you can do this, you can do this, and then he takes the shot, okay? Is he really talking to anybody? Is he really communicating? Psychologists will say no. Other people will say, well, yes, you have to have that discussion within. And again, I'm not going to wade into the conversation. My personal opinion is that no, there is no such thing as intrapersonal communication. Because if you go back to our accepted definition of communication, there has to be 2 knowing participants, and you're only 1 knowing participant. Way back when I was a federal investigator, we had a class from a psychologist, and somebody asked her, is talking to yourself a sign of any sort of mental illness? And she said, well, as long as you know what the other end of the conversation is going to say, it's not a problem. But if the other end of the conversation is telling you to do something that you don't want to do or saying things that surprise you, then we'll call that a mental illness. So I put intrapersonal communication up there just so you know that it is a thing that some people talk about, but it's really not something that we're going to talk about in this class. Now, I will say one last thing because it comes up. What about prayer? Are you talking when you're talking to God? If God talks back to you, if you feel you're really having a dialogue with God, is that intrapersonal communication? I will not wade into that theological debate, but what I will say is 2 knowing participants, If you're one and whatever deity you worship is the second, that's being communication. Second thing I'm going to talk about. What about my dog? Excuse me. Oh, the beverage today is coffee. And by coffee, I definitely don't mean bourbon. Okay, so what about your dog? My dog, I have two dogs. One is very smart, one is very strong. The smart one is medium sized, weighs about 50 pounds. The strong one weighs about 80 pounds, and he's not the sharpest tool in the shed, but he's a loving dog. We went through about, one time I was going to let him out in the backyard. He likes to go out in the backyard. He gets really excited when I go to the door. I did not have any shoes on. He used my foot to push off, and he literally ripped my toenail off. That was horrible. So we spent about a year in about 53,000 pepperoni sticks getting me to teach him when he wants to go out, he comes over and sits by where I sit on the couch. And then I hold a finger up, which means stay, and I walk to the back door. I open the back door. I get the hell out of the way, and then I say, go ahead, and he takes off. Am I communicating with my dog? I don't know. I'm not going to, again, that's something that is a argued subject. Can we truly communicate with other species on our planet? I don't know. Okay? I can't answer that question. All right? But let's talk to the ones we can talk about. Interpersonal communication. Interpersonal communication is communication between two people, usually considered two people, whose lives have mutual influence over each other. Okay? It's planned and it's unplanned. It can be short. It can be long term. Interpersonal communication is how we meet our relationship needs. It's how we build our relationships. It's how we, and again, in SBC 209, we're going to talk about that a lot. SBC 205, you really don't need all that much, just at that level. How, when, where, the regularity and other qualities of the communication can be a source of friction. Okay? And it also is our way of, when there is friction, to deal with the resolution of that conflict. Okay? Group communication, and my notes. Let me find my notes. I'm flying. I sort of combined. I didn't have the soft file, so all right, let's just go with group communication. I'll figure it out as we go along. Group communication. Group communication is communication among three or more people. Okay, once you bring in that third person, it becomes a group. And it's done to, the interacting is done to achieve a specific goal. Three more people don't really normally hang out together. It's possible to have a mutual friendship between three people, but usually it's interacting to achieve a shared goal. The goal may be unstated and possibly not even mutually agreed upon. Think about Facebook. Why are you on Facebook? I mean, does everybody there on Facebook? I mean, I'm on Facebook. I like to get in fights on Facebook. Well, I like to get discussions on Facebook. When I go and comment on something on Facebook, it becomes very clearly obvious really quickly that a lot of people there aren't there for the same purpose I am, and yet we are engaged. We meet all four criteria. We're knowing participants, the whole 9 yards. Okay? More intentional, group communication has to be more intentional and more formal than interpersonal communication. And oftentimes the membership is involuntary. Unlike interpersonal communication, you don't have to, you need to volunteer to form that one-on-one relationship. If you're thrust into a group communication environment at work, you don't have any choice. Now, three people, again, may agree to hang out together. All right? But usually, the membership in group communication is oftentimes going to be involuntary. Now, public communication. Now we've shifted over from where people can immediately engage each other to where we're now talking to groups of people. Public communication is more sender-focused, in which one person is typically responsible for identifying the topic, identifying the scope of the discussions, identifying what everybody's going to be talking about. Okay? The nature of public communication events means that the event is inherently speaker-focused, and usually they're invited to speak, or there are formal rules by which you can engage. And the most common form and rule for public communication events is hold all your questions till the end. Okay, that is me telling you that I'm going to manage when we actually have interaction. Does that mean there's no communication? No, that means there is still feedback, but I am managing the verbal aspects of the conversation. And then the last is mass communication. The key thing about mass communication is mass communication uses some usually electronic medium to transmit, either through print or now almost entirely through electronic or data formats. The first mass communication was 15th century when they invented the printing press. Okay, since then we've developed where this is a form of mass communication right here. Even though I'm only talking to 126 students, it's still mass communication because I'm using this to transmit, and there's no immediate opportunity for feedback. You're going to have to, if you have any questions about what I'm saying, you can't raise your hand. You're going to have to wait. I'm going to have to wait for you to send me an email and tell me, hey, listen, Mr. McInnes, I have some questions. Okay? For the SBC 219 guys, we're going to spend an entire lecture and maybe 2 lectures on mass communication. All right, so let's talk about models. So I, on a regular basis, have people come to me, people from publishing houses, say, hey, Mr. McInnes, you're the lead instructor for speech at that very highly respected Aiken Technical College. And yes, I have actually had somebody on the phone say that to me. Hey, you're the lead instructor for speech at highly respected Aiken Technical College. And that's not to say Aiken Technical College isn't highly respected, because we really, truly are. I was going to say believe it or not, but there's every reason you should have to believe that. Okay? So, Mr. McInnes, you're the lead speech instructor for that highly respected Aiken Technical College. They're in Aiken County, South Carolina, in the bustling metropolis of Graniteville. We've got a new speech textbook for you that we would love for you to look over. And my usual response is, okay, got it. This medium in this discipline has been studied since 300 BC. So study of speech communications is about 2,400 years old. What's new in your textbook? And they may throw something out, and I'm going like, well, Aristotle said that. Barnland said that 50 years ago. What is it you're telling me that you've got new and different? And that's why both classes have online textbooks. Because really there's not a lot. The first person who came up with a model for how communication works was Aristotle in the 4th century BCE. Okay? He was the explorer, the first person that we know of. Now, again, this is a very Western-focused model. I don't know that they weren't doing the same thing in Asia. I do know that for commonly accepted, the first person who really studied human nature and scientifically was Aristotle. And his model, we know his model was in existence in 300 BC, 2,400 years ago. Okay? In this model, it's very speaker focused, and the audience is almost passively engaged. Okay? The audience is not given a whole lot of opportunity for feedback. There is an effect that you are intending to achieve, but the speaker gives a speech which is a surrounding context of the occasion that they're speaking at. That goes out to the audience, and then you have an effect on the audience. The speaker has an effect on the audience. Now, this was the standard model for about 2,300 years. This was the standard model, and it's not like we pitched it away overnight. This was a standard speaker, speech, audience, effect, occasion. Okay? We want to jump forward about 2,350 years to 1948. This is Laswell's model. Laswell is a political science and sociologist. He authored 30 books and 250 scholarly articles on diverse subjects, including international relations, psychoanalysis, legal education. He was early in computing sciences. His focus after World War II was on power dynamics. Now, what you're going to see, a lot of what we're going to be talking about, a lot of this study happens immediately after World War II. So, World War II history for you. Germany was a broke country. I mean, they were out of money. They were they had been through civil wars and riots, and the country was really just breaking down. And then suddenly, in 1933, Hitler comes to power and really turns the nation around purely through his force of his communication and what he was able to convince the people of. And so after the war was over, the United States began to sink a lot of money into communications research, and Laswell and a whole bunch of these guys jumped onto this. And here's what Laswell came up with. Okay? He came up with, communication, or the speaker, the message, which is the speech, the medium, which has replaced the occasion, and the receiver, or the audience, in the effect. Compare the two. There's Aristotle. There's Laswell. They're nearly identical. Okay? So this study hasn't really changed. We've been putting the pieces and parts together a little bit differently. But the study is really very similar and hasn't changed a lot. By the way, Laswell's model is hugely important. It became hugely important in the 60s and 70s. People were saying the medium is the message, the effect. It became very popular, as we began to realize that what Hitler had done was a mass communication event as opposed to what we'd ever seen before. And Laswell's model became very big in advertising. It is now big again. It sort of fell out of favor. Now it's back. And again, here's the comparison explicitly. Okay? So human communication hasn't changed a lot. We're still humans. We still communicate the same way. I suppose once we start to get those implants Elon Musk keeps talking about, which is kind of freaking me out, that'll change the way we communicate. But right now, that's how we communicate. Now, in 1949, Shannon and Weaver came up with it's called the linear model. Now, I've changed the way the linear model is laid out to make it better for you to understand. You have a sender who sends a message. The receiver gets the message. Then he communicates back to the sender. Now, when Shannon and Weaver had this model in 1948, 1949, they did not use the word feedback. They had sender, receiver, sender, receiver, sender, receiver in a line ad infinitum, and it would just go on out into infinity. That is not, so rather than show that the way it really works and to put it in the context that we're going to be looking at, I've changed it a little bit to show that sender, receiver, feedback with the message that you're trying to communicate. Here's the problem with this. Number one, it only deals with two participants. Okay, there's a sender, there's a receiver, and it's very formatted. There's not a whole lot of wiggling around. Claude Shannon was a mathematician and electrical engineer with Bell Telephone Laboratories. Warren Weaver recognized that Shannon's information theory and his model had wider potential, and so in 1949 they published a book where their linear theory was discussed called The Mathematic Theory of Communication. Yeah, you see, that is the entireties of 1940s and 50s communication studies right there in what? 5 words. The mathematic theory of communication. People believed in the 40s and 50s that we could turn this into a mathematic equation. While it did start a new field of study, a communication study, it has been roundly criticized for decades as being oversimplistic. It is now making a comeback for any of y'all that ever want to go to get a PMP or a project management certification. You will see Shannon and Weaver. It's called something different, okay? But now Shannon and Weaver's linear communications model is now a key component of project management, agile, scrum management, all those sort of things, okay? The next big model that jumps up is Newcomb's ABX model. All right. So Theodore Amin Newcomb was a social psychologist who believed communication was how people adjusted and dealt with their environment and with each other. Okay. So I want you to think of A and B here as groups, individuals, countries. See, Newcomb was trying to make the engagements between, and again, we're now into a Cold War world where it's very bipolar. You have the Soviet Union, you have the Soviet Union and all their allies, you have the United States and all their allies. Newcomb is looking for a model where All communication can be explained from two people talking to each other to nations going to war with each other or threatening to go to war with each other. In the model, X is the topic that can be called a matter of concern. Anything that can affect the flow of communication between the sender and the receiver. X could be a social controversy that affects relationships. X could be another person that is affecting the relationship between two other people. But both sender and receiver are on the same level in their interpretation of the common goals, or their environment may be different, may be the same, but that interpretation, their separate independent interpretations of X, is going to modify and change the nature of their relationships. Okay? This is a very sophisticated model for 1953. It is still looked on, it's still considered a very solid model. Okay, it puts a lot of stock into the environment that people are working in. The way you may want to think about it, a good interpersonal example is A and B are a married couple. B changes his work or her work, goes to a different job. That has caused them to be away from their house more time than they were in the past. So X would be this new job, and A and B must negotiate their relationship in the context of dealing with this topic. This topic, X, forces them to communicate. Okay? On a grand scale, on a global scale, two nations lay claim to the same mountain range that is rich with copper. The topic they have to negotiate with and deal with is that mountain range. That forces them to communicate with each other. Good, solid model. Newcomb was way ahead of his time. Okay. Now, Osgood and Schramm in 1954 came up with this model, and we're going to talk about encoding and decoding a little bit later. But Charles Osgood popularized the notion that communication was circular rather than linear. Okay. Schramm adopted the model and added the notion of fields of experience, commonality, things like that. All that stuff is not carried in a short model like I've given you here. The model breaks the sender and receiver mode, where both two people involved in a conversation, two groups of people are constantly encoding and decoding messages, and we'll define encoding and decoding in a minute. But there is no pure sender or receiver. This is an ongoing cyclical process. It's very dynamic. It shows why redundancy is an essential part of communication, because to make sure that messages are encoded and decoded properly. And it also has feedback as a key component of this model. And this was really one of the first ones where in their discussions of the process, Osgood and Schramm both said that feedback is very essential for successful communication. So the next thing we're going to come to is the Barnlund transactional model. And I tried to find a good representation of Barnlund, and they're just, well, you could take Barnlund's original transactional model, and I think there were like 88 different, if this has got 4 components to it, Barnlund had like 88, I think. It's very complex. Barnlund was, again, Dean C. Barnlund spent World War II in military intelligence. He was specifically in cryptanalysis, the making and breaking of codes. And he was one of the fathers, again, one of these guys that was the father of modern computing. A lot of these guys who had been in communication theory, they were also engineers, so they took that in, they combined those two and brought them out and started writing computer languages. Barnlund said that communication is a word that describes the process of creating a joint meaning. Okay, something we can all agree on. The transactional model has multiple layers of feedbacks going in both directions all the time. The actual model includes filters like personal prejudices and noise like outside influences that impede communication. But ultimately, communication depends on the sender and receiver understanding the codes each other uses to communicate. But if a relationship is to grow, shared codes and meanings must be built. Now, in our model here, it's a classroom or a public communication event. What you're seeing is, and what this very brief model of it allows for, is that when I'm talking to people now, again, it's very difficult here in an online class, but when I'm in a classroom and I've got 25 people in the classroom, I'm not having one conversation. I'm having 25 separate conversations and 25 separate dialogues, one with each individual student, or at least that's the goal. Now, realistically, there's in a class of 20, or 25, I've got 15 students that are just like sitting there taking notes, paying attention, and so they don't get a whole lot of attention. It's the guy in the back that guy's getting a lot of my attention, even though he's not communicating with me. We don't have two knowing participants. There's that person that's really giving you a lot of feedback. No. You're having a lot of conversation with them. But what Barnlin allowed was that even in a group, even in a public communication situation like that, we derived an agreed upon meaning of what we're doing there. And we agree as an entity that we have these meanings and these codes that we all agree with. Okay? And every class and every group is different. It always amazes me that, has always amazed me that when I'm teaching 4 or 5 sections of different classes, how they engage each other differently. And I used to think it was based on time, but the more and more I deal with it, and the more and more experience I have in the classroom, I think it's random. It's just the people, the 25 different people, well, 26 counting me, people that are in there, we all come in with different codes. We have to develop a joint codes and joint meanings. And the development of that is varied almost infinitely by the number of people that are in the room. I mean, if you look at the different combinations. But Barnlin really was focused on that shared meaning, those shared codes. And if our relationships are going to develop, and even in public speaking, it's a relationship with the audience. If we're going to have to develop those mutual codes and meanings that we all agree on. The next is Dance's Helix model, and it was developed by Frank E.X. Dance. This is the one I put all my faith in. Dance also was in Army intelligence. He worked in code breaking. He worked in computer languages. His theory is built on the idea, and uses as a key more than any other of the models, is that human communication is irreversible. You've all heard the phrase, you can't unring that bell. And I tell this story, my wife knows I tell this story. She doesn't appreciate it, but she sort of understands why I do it. Back a long time ago, we've been married, it'll be 30 years in a couple of weeks, in March. Back when we were engaged, running up to our wedding, my wife knows I say this. My mother-in-law is Satan, come to earth. She is an evil person, and she went out of her way to make our lives miserable in the run up to the wedding, and it caused a lot of tension. And we fought a lot, and we used to get into and again, a lot of married couples fight right up to the wedding, and then things calm down, and you lived happily ever after, which is, I think, what's happened with us. But running up to that, just before we got married, we got into a really, really big fight. Don't remember what it was over. Neither one of us do. But in the course of that event, she said some things to me. I said some things to her. She said something to me, and just the words came out of my mouth that said, I may be bad, but at least I'm not your mother. Now, I will tell you, before that sentence finished leaving my mouth, I knew I should have never said it. And it actually came out as, I may be bad, but at least I'm not your mother. And I am so sorry I just said that. That was completely inappropriate and wrong, and I apologize, and I wish I could take it back. Do you think she let me take it back? Oh, no. Oh, no, no, no. That was out there. Our relationship had changed. Okay? I will tell you, that happened in February of 1991. I still hear about that comment. And again, married couples do, when we get in a fight, there is liable to be, if it's gotten bad enough, she's liable to be, what are you going to tell me? I'm like my mother. Okay? That's when I know we don't need to be in the same room together for a while. Okay? And that's been 30 years ago. All right? Once you say something, once you engage with a person, the nature of your relationship changes, and it changes every single time you engaged. Okay? Every interaction changes the nature of every other interaction that follows. Once the relationship is changed, it can never return to where it was. Okay? So we start with person one and person two. Person one reaches out and says something to person two. Person two is affected by that and creates person 2A. Person 2A responds to person one, and person one is affected and changed by that, creating person 1A. P1A responds to P2A and creates P2B. Now, why am I locked up here? We're going to continue, see what's going to happen. I'm recording this in QuickTime, so you get to see all of that, but it really doesn't make any difference. Okay. All right, so maybe at 40 minutes, the time's up. It's a new MacBook. I'm still getting used to some of the controls on it. Good time to chat. Take a sip of coffee. And by coffee, we mean surely coffee. It's coffee, right? Okay. All right, so P1A responds to P2A, which creates P2B, who responds to P1A, creating P1B. And back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth ad infinitum. Now, this does not contradict anything that we've said so far. Okay? Go back and look. I mean, we're creating joint meanings. This is how we create joint meanings. You have a sender, you can say a sender and receiver. All right? So it is key in this, though. Remember that relationships are always advancing. They can't help but advance. Even if you've got that one person that, you know, you're always sitting there and you see them at work and you see them in the hall and you go, hey, how you doing? And you go, oh, I'm fine. How are you? Okay? Yeah, it's changing a little bit, but if that person walks by you and doesn't say, hey, how you doing? You're sitting there the whole, you know, when they say, hey, how you doing? It's like, they don't care. They don't care. They don't care about me. But then that one day when they don't say, hey, how you doing? You're like sitting there going, what's the hell wrong with them? Are they mad at me for something? You change the nature of the relationship. Okay? Now, let's talk about encoding and decoding. Now, this was developed in 1980 by Stuart Hall. It involves active audience theory, and that's stuff you guys don't care about. But it does focus on the audience engagement. So here's how to understand it. Have you guys ever been trying to tell somebody something and describe something to somebody and you just can't get the words to give you the right sensation? I've had to deal with Air Force fighter pilots. I did deal with Air Force fighter pilots my entire career. They don't have the words because most of us, believe it or not, live in a two-dimensional world. It's the surface of the earth is what we deal with. And even though, yeah, there's some, but really you don't work in three dimensions like a fighter pilot does. And if you notice, the fighter pilots just quit using language and start, you know, if you watch Top Gun, okay, they'll start using their hands to demonstrate what they can't describe. You start talking about things like love and happiness and hate and anger. And, you know, and you sit there and you look at somebody and you say, why are you so angry? And they will try to come up with the words and they're just like, I don't know, it just pisses me off. Okay? What you're doing there is you're having difficulties encoding a message. As you see our guy here on the left, the messenger, he has something that he means, a feeling, an idea, a thought that he wants to communicate to another person. We have channels for that. We have ways to encode that. Usually it's in the form of language, verbal or nonverbal, that we've all mutually agreed upon. So when in here in South Carolina, for the most part, we take words from a mutually agreed upon language, you know, the English, Spanish, whatever, and we start putting words together that and encoding our thoughts into those words. Then we pass that as a message. And then that comes to the receiver, who then decodes it. Okay? Is encoding and decoding precise? Absolutely not. Okay? Have you ever said something to somebody and gone, well, and have them react? You're going like, no, that's not what I meant. Okay? Well, did you say this? Yeah, but that's not what I meant. That's what I said, but that's not what I meant. Let me try it again. And you go back and forth. One of the things that a lot of people do in couples therapy is they hash out ways to be able to deal with encoding and decoding problems within their relationship. Okay? So we encode things into language, and then we pass them through the message, and then they have to be decoded. And if they aren't decoded properly, then we run into trouble. Now, all human communication is part of a dialogue. Okay, remember how we talked about those 4? Feedback is one of those. Okay, many of us see public communication, small group communication, public communication, mass communication, as sender just talking. And we've all seen those guys. You probably had, for those of y'all who are recent high school graduates, you had that guy in high school. For those of y'all who have seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and if you haven't, what is wrong with you? Go see it this weekend. In Ferris, Ben Stein plays that great role of the government teacher, where he's just where he's just droning on and he's not talking or listening or look. He's got students that are asleep. Bueller, okay. That's how many of us envision public communication. But all communication has to be looked at as a conversation or a dialogue between at least 2 people. Now, again, that feedback loop is sometimes long and extended. Okay? Mass communication, you're not going to get immediate feedback. I'm going to have to wait for you guys to send me emails. I'm going to have to wait for you guys to take quizzes and do discussion boards and take tests and 205, give me speeches to see whether or not I'm being effective in communicating. But that's a dialogue. Okay, go back to the components of communication from the very beginning. You have to have at least 2 people, knowing participants, okay, or 2 cultures or 2 groups. And you have to have feedback. All right? Incorporate Barnland's transactional model and Dance's Helix, and we have a method for providing feedback that alters the nature of the relationships and builds the very relationship. Now, again, a lot of you guys at 205 are going like, why is he talking to us about this? We're in public speaking. And feedback for this is done in public speaking in this environment where you're taping it and posting it is really hard. I understand. Okay? I'm completely with you. But the problem is that when you start thinking like that as a public speaker, you stop listening and paying attention to what's going on in the audience. You stop making eye contact, you stop gesturing, you focus on your cards, and you lose the audience. And for you interpersonal communications people, how many times have you been talking to somebody and then have them go, oh, hold on a second. Continue. I'm listening. And they're on their phones. Okay? So that idea of having a dialogue, even in a mass communication environment, how do you give feedback to? I'm trying to think of a show that I would watch that you guys would watch, and it's very hard for me to come up with one. Zoe's Extraordinary Playlist. Okay, it's coming on tonight. I like that show. All right, how do I give feedback to the guys who create that show? Through ratings, by watching it. The more people watch it, they know they've got a good show that people enjoy, allows them to sell more advertising. Nielsen ratings is how you give feedbacks to network television. My disc is almost full, okay? And then, again, characteristics of a dialogue, there's a mutuality. There has to be a recognition, knowing participants. There's propinquity. There's a spontaneity of interactions. We can't script a conversation, okay? The least amount of propinquity I've ever seen in a conversation was I used to work in a watch center in Washington, D.C., and one of our jobs was if there was a national disaster, we would have to send out what was called an emergency action message, which would basically the only time I know of that it would happen would be if there was a nuclear attack on the United States. Our job was to forward that message to everywhere around the world. And when it was scripted, it literally said, the senior operations officer will read the code back to the operations support officer. If the code is correct, the operations support officer will say, and I looked up at him and said, I agree. And it was scripted all the way through. Human relationships don't look like that. If somebody feels like you're trying to manipulate the relationship to a separate outcome, they may not agree to be in that relationship anymore. Okay? There has to be empathy. There has to be, for there to be a dialogue, there has to be some acknowledgement that the other person involved is important, they have feelings, and they need to be engaged with. You need to be supportive of them. There has to be risk. Again, the stated or implied intention to communicate with someone on their own terms. So if you have that empathy, you have that propinquity, you're going to have to admit that you don't have total control of the outcome of the relationship. And then there has to be a degree of commitment. Okay? Now, again, for interpersonal communication, for you guys in 209, this is going to all be very obvious as we develop our interpersonal communication theories. For you guys in 205, you're like sitting there going, I don't understand why this is. I'm just reading a speech. Well, number one, you're not reading a speech in my class. And number two, when you engage in dialogic theory, you bring the audience into you and make yourself a better public speaker. Yeah, you can't ignore the audience all you want. Okay? And for all the problems I have with Donald Trump as a public speaker, I'm not talking about his politics. I'm not talking about him as a human being or anything else. For all his faults as a public speaker, and he is an awful public speaker, okay? He understands dialogic theory. He understands that when he's addressing 40, 50,000 people, he understands he is involved in a dialogue with them. Now, to the extreme, you wind up with what Donald Trump gets, and they get up there and they ramble for 2.5 hours. Okay? And there are times when he fails on dialogic theory because you'll see people in his stands just completely tuned out and sleeping. But then when he sees that, I mean, I've watched his speeches where he's talking about something that clearly nobody cares about. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he'll pause for a second and he goes, "Hey, what about the wall?" And everybody is suddenly tuned back in. Okay? So there has to be a degree of commitment. And again, dialogic theory, understanding dialogic theory and applying it to both your interpersonal communications, your interpersonal communications, your public communications, your group communications, and your mass communications, all is going to make you a more effective communicator and give you more communication competence. Let's talk about, again, we communicate to meet our needs. We communicate to meet physical needs like food and water. One of the first things we learn is, kids, baba means, oh, here's a bottle. If you give a kid a bottle when they say baba, they're going to keep calling it that because they learn that that's how they get their physical needs met. We have our instrumental needs, which are our long and short-term goals. And then we have relational needs, like how do I keep my wife from stabbing me in the night? That's a conversation I have with myself every day. I'm kidding. My wife is a lovely person. Then we have to, the goal here is communication competence. And these are the three key factors in communication competence. You have to be adaptable to the environment. You have to understand the context. And again, remember we talked right off the bat about the cultural context. Your communication has to be appropriate, and your communication has to be effective. And you have to be able to sort of read the audience and then be engaged in that dialogue to understand. Had a student a couple of semesters ago, a great guy, retired Army NCO, a non-commissioned officer. He was a sergeant first class in the Army, was a combat medic, was a great guy, really a good speaker. Just I had to break him of some habits. And one of the things that he had to do was he got up and gave his first speech. And it was about physical fitness training. And he was a master fitness trainer in the Army. He was well qualified, had a lot of good ideas. And he kept talking, and then about a minute and a half into his first speech, he said, "Now you females," and you could look and sitting in the back of the room like I did, you could see half the audience. And again, in a class of 25, I counted there were 18 women in that class. Half of those people, 9, that's a third of his audience, just went. And then you could literally physically see some of them doing this. And they just became completely dismissive, zoned out, or they actually looked like they were becoming hostile. And the more and more he said it, you females. it just got worse and worse. So afterwards, I said, "Hey, listen, we need to have a talk," because I knew where he was coming from and I knew why he was doing it. And I came in and said, "Dude, you did not do well in that speech, and let me explain to you why. The you female thing is not going to work." And he said, "I don't understand this. I was a master, fitness instructor in Korea. They loved me. I got high praise." And I said, "Yeah, but the United States Army, 22% female. That class, 18 out of 25. Okay, you were targeting the do the math. What, 7 males in the audience and losing 2/3 of your audience?" And he was like, and what he said was quite funny, and it was also very profane. So I won't repeat it. It was like, "Oh, sake." And I just talked to him and I said, "Listen, you need to understand that, and you need to break that habit, and you need to look at your audience, because you also didn't notice that number one, you weren't adaptable. Number two, your language wasn't appropriate. And number three, if you had looked at it, you weren't being effective. You weren't in a dialogue with the audience. You were just beaming. You were just one way, because anybody that looked at that audience would have noticed that you were not communicating with with at least 2/3 of the audience." And he was like, "Got it." And again, I tell that story because, number one, I like the guy a lot. He has since gone on. He's graduated from here and gone on to bigger and better things. But the second reason I tell that is because he learned from he took the feedback I gave him, he took the critiques I gave him, and got fantastic at it. Wound up getting an A out of it. I mean, had a B on, I think it was a low B or a high C on that one speech, but recovered quickly and gave 2 follow-on speeches that were great, did well, and finally got an A out of the class, which is a lesson to you public speakers. Okay. And again, we all should be seeing that in our day-to-day communications and our relationships, and is that we need to be adaptable. We need to change with the environment. We need to understand the appropriateness. There's things I say, in class that I won't say, and again, 209, you won't get to see this as much as the 205 guys will. Me giving a public speech, a formal speech, I'm way different than me giving a lecture. Okay? And that's because of appropriateness. And then I get feedback from you guys. You'll get to do the end of course surveys, and I'll look at that feedback for you to measure my effectiveness. Okay. Remember, all communication is a process. It is a journey, not a destination. Communication is guided by and happens in a cultural context, and we're going to talk about that more later on for both classes. And communication has ethical implications for the person communicating. And we're going to go back to Aristotle, and we're going to talk about ethos. We're going to talk about ethical models of communication and all that good stuff. All right. Huzzah! We are at the end of Lecture 1, SBC 209 and SBC 205. That is our joint lecture for today. If you have, and again, this will be one of the longest lectures I give. I try to keep them under an hour because just staring at me on YouTube has got to be horrible. I can't imagine doing it. So I try to keep these down to about 45 minutes to 50 minutes. This one I think is probably gone a little over an hour, or is right up against an hour. Again, if you have any questions for me, send me an email. I will be communicating with both classes separately today and tomorrow about your quiz.